His breathing quickened, his pupils dilated, blood trickling from a barely visible cut on the man's neck. He's dead, definitely dead, right now. And the higher vampire could no longer control his bloodlust. He did not stand a chance. There was no way he could survive. There is no power in this world that can withstand the power of an immortal creature of inhuman strength. Some call them monsters. Others sympathize with them because of their natural dependency and the suffering life has in store for them. Even more worship them as gods. And there are also those that fear them and wish they had never met such a horror. But the higher vampires leave no one indifferent. They are so easy to confuse with ordinary humans. Their lives are so interesting to observe. In the universe of The Witcher though, higher vampires are given a great deal of attention, for it would be a literal sacrilege to ignore this phenomenon of world culture. Well, for now, it's the old Witcher, from the School of the Beer, right here. As always, we are grateful for the support of our patrons, who motivate us to keep making these videos. Thank you very much. Join the ranks of these cool people, and we promise you even more content about the Witcher universe in return. Anyways, get yourself something delicious, because today we're gonna tell you in detail about the truly supreme vampires of the Witcher universe. The higher vampires. Regis, Dettlaff, Unseen Elder, they're waiting. Higher vampires mythology. As always, let us delve into the myths and legends of our ancestors first, because many of the answers to the questions about the supernatural vampires of the Witcher universe can be found there. The phenomenon of terrifying nocturnal creatures that hunt humans to feed on their blood has been a part of world culture for a very long time. Even ancient archaeological finds from the times of the Sumerians and Babylonians speak of them. But back then they were not called vampires and were treated as ordinary undead, mixed in with the standard devilish fauna. We've covered many of them in previous Witcher Vampire Bestiary issues, so we will not repeat ourselves. Instead, let us talk about today's quote-unquote canonical image of an immortal bloodsucker who sleeps in a coffin, looks like an ordinary man, and can turn into a bat. In the historical content, this image appeared not so long ago and acquired all the features during the last centuries of the existence of this world. The vampire craze began in the 18th century. The first historically documented wave of vampire panic swept through the territories of East Prussia and the Habsburg monarchy in 1721. At the time, Austria included parts of Bosnia, Serbia, and Romania. Legends of vampires had been used in the Balkan countries since time immemorial, but to the Austrians there was something unnatural. From the conquered territories, Austria began to receive mass complaints of vampire terror. The shocked authorities tried to find out what was going on. The first documented story about vampires is related to an article in the newspaper that goes by the name of Emiel Regis diarium. In 1722, residents of the village of Kiselova said that a certain Petar Blagojevich died after being kicked by a horse. The man was 62 years old. He was buried, but the day after his funeral he appeared to his own son and asked him for food. The boy refused to feed the undead ancestor, and after that 9 people in the village died, along with the very son who refused to feed his dead father. The deceased one is said to have come to each of them and sucked their blood. The villagers complained about the rampaging ghoul to an official named Frombold. He decided to open the grave in the presence of the priest. It turned out that Blagojevich's body was untouched by decomposition. It was cremated and the deaths in the village stopped. Interestingly though, Kiselova still exists, and in our time it is a very attractive place for a number of dubious journalists and psychics. They are exploring the mentioned area, and with one voice, they say that they feel an incredibly powerful energy field at the place where Petar Blagojevich's grave used to be. The next case of quote-unquote vampirism is connected with the name of Hajduk Arnaut Pavle in the villages of Medved and dates back to 1731. After his death, Arnaut appeared to several people who were soon found dead. In a few days, 9 people died in Medved and then 5 more people died. The Austrian doctor Glaser came to the village at the request of the people. He interviewed the relatives of the last victim of the vampire and found out that she had simply died of prolonged starvation. The villagers were not satisfied with this answer, however, and took Glaser to the cemetery. The doctor was amazed at what he saw, as some of the bodies simply did not decompose. Not knowing what to do, he summoned a whole commission of military doctors to Medved. headed by the famous Dr. John Fluckinger. Fluckinger conducted an investigation in which he examined the last 40 people who had died in Medwit. The bodies of 17 of them had not decomposed, and the doctor ordered that they be beheaded, aspen stakes driven into their chests, and then burned. Fluckinger spent some time in the village and completed his investigation. The result was as follows. The doctor claimed that the deceased vampire Hajduk drank the blood of the cows. The people ate the meat of the cows, which somehow became contagious. The villagers who ate the meat of the contagious cows died and turned into vampires. The report with such conclusions of research was presented to the Emperor of Austria. In the following year, the Dr. Glaser, or someone on his behalf, who as we said was the first to come to Medwit, together with his father Johann Friedrich Glaser, wrote a fictional account of these events and this investigation. The story was a heavily embellished version of Fluckinger's report, but it immediately became extremely popular, circulated throughout the country, and even became a bestseller at the Leipzig Fair that same year. That same report became so popular that it caused mass vampire hysteria throughout Austria. It is worth noting that this report is considered harmful and pseudoscientific by the modern medical community. But the hysteria it caused did not just go away, and the obsession with vampires was so strong that it seeped into the highest circles of intellectuals and scientists. For example, in 1746, the French theologian, historian and scientist going by the name of Antoine Augustin Calmet wrote a book called Traité sur les apparitions des esprits et sur les vampires ou les revenants d'Hongrie, Moravie, etc. In English, going like this: Treatise on the apparitions of spirits and on vampires or revenants of Hungary, Moravia, etc. And although he did not prove the existence of vampires, but only assumed it, for ordinary people this text served as an inviolable dogma and confirmation of the existence of bloodsuckers rising from the dead. It was only a few decades later that the Empress Maria Theresa's personal physician, Geralt van Sweden, after investigating peasants' complaints about vampires, was able to completely debunk the myth of vampirism by suspending the hysteria. He subjected the work of Glaser and Augustine to overwhelming criticism. In the end, he also reduced the stories of vampires to what they originally were: just frightening legends of mysticism used to keep young people indoors at night. After the peasants realized that no scientist actually supported the theory of the existence of vampires, the cries of bloodsuckers on every corner subsided a bit. Maria Theresa, on the advice of Geralt van Sweden, issued a decree forbidding the opening of graves after burial, and with the snap of a finger, the complaints about rampaging bloodsuckers virtually ceased. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand, and yet which are? That some people see things that others cannot, but there are things old and new which must not be contemplated by man's eyes, because they know or think they know some things which other men have told them. It is the fault of our science that wants to explain all, and if it explain not, then it says there is nothing to explain. The outbreak of vampire hysteria in the 18th century left both archaeological evidence and a huge trace in history. For example, a unique burial site, a vampire cemetery, was recently found in the village of Czelakowice, not far from Prague. 11 people rest in the cemetery, all men between the ages of 20 and 60. Their bodies bear the marks of typical anti-vampire measures. The head is cut off, hands and feet are bound, the grave is piled with heavy stones, and so on and so forth, so that the vampire would definitely not be able to get out of the grave. Local outbreaks of vampirism, however, came much later. From Austria, the legends quickly spread to New England in the late 18th and early 19th century, and their main inspiration to this day is the legendary Irish novelist Bram Stoker. The story of how he wrote his iconic novel is still legendary today. The character of Bram Stoker's Count Dracula has become so significant in world culture that he can only be compared to 2 or 3 fictional characters in human history. Interestingly, the Irish author created his work under the influence of the vampire hysteria of the 18th century. He was particularly inspired by the work of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and his Gothic vampire novel Carmilla. The prototype of the legendary Van Helsing, for example, was Geralt van Sweden, the same doctor who did his best to stop the vampire hysteria in Austria at the end of the 18th century. There is no point in retelling the plot of Count Dracula. Our team recommends everyone interested in vampire themes to read this work. if they have not already done so, for it is the image of the terrible vampire that has become the prototype for most of the fictional bloodsuckers of our world. This is true for almost all vampires of our time, from the American comic universe of Marvel to the Polish fantasy world of The Witcher. However, the canonical image of the higher vampire was always and is always and will always be absolute. Let us try to remember the most famous representatives of the vampire quote-unquote family in history. Count Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, ruler of Wallachia and a sadist whose court was constantly subjected to brutal executions and bloodshed. Count Vergoshi was a ruler who lived in Central Europe and spent all his free time with orgies, perversions and bloody executions. He committed suicide during one of the most gruesome orgies. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a psychopath who murdered hundreds of innocent girls, at least tortured them, and if the stories are to be believed, bathed in their blood. Dr. Heinrich Spatz was a doctor who helped rich people for money and took poor people to his basement, tortured them, killed them, and practiced cannibalism. Fritz Harman was a serial killer who was declared a vampire by the courts because of his brutality and refused to be recognized as human, and much, much more. It should be understood that it was the writers who began the process of romanticizing the image of the vampire, and this romanticization had nothing to do with the legends and tales with which it all began. This is why it is very difficult to call the Witcher saga a dark fantasy from a mythological point of view. Higher vampires in the Witcher books and games. In the Witcher universe, vampires are divided into species from the common animal-like predators to the highest individuals, which are beyond bloodlust and all stereotypes. This video is about the most advanced vampires, the ones that stand out even among their tribes and are extremely interesting characters from all points of view. In the Witcher book universe, there is only one such interesting vampire character, and that is Regis. We have a separate video about his amazing story outside the books, so do check it out. It answers the question of the relationship between Regis and Dettlaff. There are two other amazing higher vampires in the game universe besides everyone's favorite Witcher friend. Real personalities, Dettlaff and the Unseen Elder. So let us talk about them all, because in the fates of these three characters lies the whole essence of the higher vampire as a species in the world of The Witcher. Regis in the books. It is difficult to ask a man to cut through his fears. Fear plays a part in the human psyche that is no less important than other emotional states. A psyche devoid of fear is a crippled psyche. Emiel Regis Rogalek Terziev Godfroy first appears in the pages of the Witcher saga in the novel Baptism of Fire. Geralt of Rivia, who after the terrible events of Thanet is searching for Ciri together with Dandelion, Milva, whose real name is Maria Baring, Zoltan Kivay, and many other dwarves and refugees, meets him in the cemetery of Fenkarn. Over there, Regis introduces himself as a barber. When asked about what exactly an ordinary barber was doing in the middle of a war in the middle of nowhere, Regis answers that he is also something of a doctor who collects herbs and distills potions in Fenkarn. The barber invites Geralt and his party to his house and treats them all to some mandrake moonshine. He immediately surprises the Witcher with his skills of observation and realizes after a single glance that Geralt was badly wounded and was treated by the Druids of Brokilon. He carries a bag with a set of strong-smelling herbs. In the morning, Regis decides to join the Witcher, and from this point on, he becomes one of the central characters in the story of Geralt of Rivia. In a refugee camp, Regis rescues a madwoman who has been called an evil witch by a priest of one of the new cults. He pulls a red-hot horseshoe out of the fire and brings it to the priest without burning himself. This incident makes Geralt suspicious, but there is no time to find stuff out. The refugee camp becomes the scene of a battle between the armies of Nilfgaard and Temeria, and Geralt and Dandelion are captured by the Second Army. They no longer hope to be rescued, but at night they are freed by Regis alone, and Geralt realizes that the barber is not as ordinary as he seemed. Emiel Regis Rogalek Terziev Godfroy is forced to explain himself and tells Geralt that he is a higher vampire who has lived for 428 years and that he is a descendant of the destroyed unfortunate beings who were trapped among humans after the conjunction of his fears. He carries a bag of herbs with him to interrupt the vampire's scent so that the beast who smell it will not be frightened. In his youth, Regis used to be a bloodthirsty beast. He killed people indiscriminately and savored their blood. But after he was captured one day, doused with holy water, beheaded and buried underground, He had many decades to reflect on his life. Regis made the decision to bring goodness and compassion to the world and gave up killing and blood altogether. Having spoken about his life, the vampire is surprised that Geralt does not want to kill him, and the witch says that he would only accept this order if the payment was diabolical. Geralt doubts that anyone in this world could pay such money. Regis leaves Geralt's company but returns later. He is the last member of the team searching for Ciri, which included the Nilfgaardian named Cahir, the archer Milva, Dandelion, Regis, and Geralt. Throughout the story, Regis acts as a kind and wise uncle. He can read minds and likes to answer questions before they're asked, eats normal food, and has completely renounced human blood. Through his mouth, Andrzej Sapkowski explains how he sees vampires. For Regis tells us a lot about vampire customs, his youth, and how blood affects his kind of creatures. Pan Sapkowski also shows the reader the image of a creature who, even though it was born evil, was able to become good by overcoming its nature. Regis saves Milva when the latter miscarries. He helps in the battles against the mercenaries of Skellen and Vilgefortz. Later, he also saves Geralt from a difficult choice by having an affair with a certain succubus who was supposed to be killed by Henrietta, but whom many men in the vicinity wanted to be spared. The sorceress Fringilla Vigo, who Geralt had a serious affair with, told the Lodge of the Sorceresses that of all the witch's companions, Regis was the only one she could not understand. Regis is a loyal and kind friend of Geralt's, and in the end, like all the others, he is brought by fate to the Stygia castle. There he acts as an indispensable fighting unit and drinks human blood for the first time in many years after killing the underlings of the imperial coroner Stefan Skellen. However, he overestimates himself and attacks the sorcerer Vilgefortz to save Yennefer and Geralt. Vilgefortz easily deals with a vampire and tears him apart with his bare hands. After that, he shoots some white energy at Regis, which melts a pillar in the hall and turns the vampire's body into a shapeless lump. After the fight with the mad sorcerer, Yennefer asks Geralt who Regis was. "Who was that Geralt, friend? I'm going to miss him. Was he a human? Epitomality." In the book Saga, Regis can be considered dead. It would be hardly possible for him to recover after the battle with Vilgefortz. Plus, the Lodge of the Sorceresses left no stone unturned at Stygia Castle. But in the game series though, CD Projekt Red brought Regis back to life to the delight of all fans and made him one of the main faces of the Blood and Wine DLC. Regis in games. The joy that every fan of the book Saga felt at the sight of Regis in the Blood and Wine DLC is hard to describe. Even in the books, we were given a small and obscure hint that Regis was actually alive, but in the game version he appeared in full glory as the main link in the story. On behalf of Henrietta, Geralt searches for the beast of Toussaint that is terrorizing everyone. The Witcher gets on its trail, discovers that the beast is a higher vampire and fights it. But at some point, Regis interferes in the fight and the Witcher must work with an old acquaintance to find out what happened. It turns out that Regis survived his confrontation with Vilgefortz thanks to another higher vampire named Dettlaff. The latter helped Regis regenerate by sacrificing his own blood. Dettlaff turns out to be an emotional and unstable creature. Attempts to reason with him are futile. He is the beast of Toussaint. He has power over the lesser vampires, and in revenge for his broken heart, he decides to drown Toussaint in blood. Geralt gets in his way, and Regis has to choose a side: an old friend with whom he's been through everything, or one of his kin who saved his life and shared his own blood to do it. And the vampire chooses Geralt, because the higher vampire can only be killed in one way, and now the vampire has to suck the blood out of him completely. Regis does just that, and the circle is closed. Dettlaff van der Eretain dies at the hands of the vampire he saved. Regis, however, has an incredibly hard time. It is indeed a hard fate for someone who tries to be good and do the right thing. Interestingly though, Regis's parents were definitely vampires from another world. Regis himself notes that his full name is in keeping with vampire tradition. At the same time, Dettlaff was probably born relatively recently, by vampire standards that is, and his parents were individuals living on the continent. All because Dettlaff's name is already more in line with the tradition of humans from the kingdoms of the continent. It is very difficult to find analogues of Regis in world mythology because there are almost no compassionate and kind vampires. But there are many of them in literature and cinema. The Vampire Chronicles is a good example. It makes us realize how hard and difficult it can be for a seemingly horrible creature to live properly in this world. The Unseen Elder. Regis and Dettlaff are powerful vampires, but there is someone beyond the competition and beyond the usual framework of comparison. This vampire is to be called not just a superior, but a quote-unquote truly superior being. His name is simple, no gimmicks. The Unseen Elder, but the mere sight of his dead eyes, coupled with the eternal vigil in the cave of Hengate, brings incredible despair and the realization of utter powerlessness. The Bestiary entry reads, Geralt was as intrigued as I was, and I imagine you shall be, to learn higher vampire society is organized in a strict hierarchy based on age. The older a vampire, the greater his say in their matters and the stricter the punishment for going against his will. One extremely elder vampire lived in Beauclair, in the cave where he had been deposited during the conjunction of the spheres. Geralt and Regis decided they had to go see him to get his help in finding Dettlaff. The only problem was that the more ancient members of the vampiric race were not very, how to put this, amenable to company. This particular elder so deeply disliked visitors, Regis trembled at the very thought of having to disturb his peace. Geralt had a difficult decision to make. Should he risk a visit to the elder's domain or try to find Sienna? Regis's reservation about visiting the Unseen Elder were not at all unfounded. Though in the end Geralt was able to convince this being to help, he almost had to pay with his own and Regis's lives. Luckily, however, all ended well and Geralt and Regis left the Elder's cave alive and unharmed, though perhaps a little shaken up, with a guarantee Dettlaff would soon meet them at Tesha Mutna. It is impossible to say exactly who the Unseen Elder is. Simply put, he is the leader of all the vampires living in Toussaint territory. But if you dig a little deeper, here's our video about the Unseen Elder. Go ahead and watch it. What was I saying? Yeah. The Unseen Elder's connection to all other vampires is supernatural. A word or thought from the Unseen Elder can make any vampire obey. It seems that the Unseen Elder is like the head of the vampire lineage from which all other vampires on the continent are descended. He's like a spiritual father to all the vampires in the area. Interestingly, the entire continent is divided among the Unseen Elders. They're not always reclusive, but they're always deadly to humans. Nobody knows about it, but humans live in peace only with the permission of the Unseen Elders, because if they decided to turn against humans, it is hard to imagine a power that could stop them. The famous witcher Geralt of Rivia, for example, would not stand a chance, even though he has faced incredibly powerful beings in his life and always emerged victorious. The Unseen Elders have an important mission: to protect the gates between the worlds. All vampires turn out to be mere victims of the cataclysmic conjunction of the spheres. The continent is alien for them, and the portals closed after they brought the vampires where they currently are. They are still dormant and will likely remain so for hundreds or thousands of years. But that does not seem to stop the Unseen Elders. They will wait until the end of time because they are immortal. 100 years is just a moment for them, and they cannot imagine any other purpose of existence than to return to their homeworld. Even when Geralt asks the Unseen Elder to help him lure Dettlaff out, he only listens due to one reason: the threat that vampires will be hunted down and the vault of the cave with the gate to the other world will be destroyed. The Unseen Elder looks nothing like a human. He is tall, deathly pale, most likely due to his reclusive lifestyle, and thin. His entire body is covered with strange markings, which later add up to symbols of an unknown language, and the eye-like shape in the center of his chest. This mark most likely symbolizes the eternal watch of the Unseen Elder. There are several altars in Toussaint with symbols tattooed on the body of the Unseen Elder. It seems to be a part of the continent's vampire culture. Interestingly, a mural on a cave wall depicts the Unseen Elder in human form with webbed wings. This speaks to the vampire's ability to grow these wings without having to transform into a large cave dweller, a bat, that is. It is known that all Unseen Elders are well over 1500 years old, as they all came into this world during the conjunction of the spheres. Their power is so great because it is rooted in the other world and does not depend on natural sources like human magic. The vampires of the continent are gradually degenerating and their power is weakening. Since vampires can probably reproduce in a normal human-like way, seek mates, know how to love, and experience all kinds of emotions, the Unseen Elders were once just higher vampires who evolved and dedicated themselves to a single mission. It is unclear how to kill an Unseen Elder, or if it is even possible. Most likely, such powerful beings only die in personal battles, when one unseen elder drains the blood of the other. The unseen elder's only motivation is to preserve the gate to another world. Therefore, it is possible to somehow influence him by using only this single argument. When creating the Unseen Elder, CD Projekt Red devs were inspired by the images of Count Dracula, Count Orlok from the classic movie Nosferatu: Symphony of Terror, and the more recent look of the vampire leader Victor from the Underworld movie series. In the world mythology, the vampires are of such great strength that people could not even imagine it, preferring to hope that an aspen stake or holy water might save them from the bloodsucker. But in any case, the image of the Unseen Elder from the Witcher game series turned out to be incredible and memorable. It is his appearance that best represents the image of the all-powerful and ruthless evil, which happens to be indifferent to some lowly humans, etc. That is all for today's video. The Witcher's Vampire Bestiary series is over, and it is time for a whole bunch of other equally interesting monsters and more. Give us a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell so you don't miss future videos. Do write comments about the next video topics and become a patron to influence the choice of topics. Also write about things the author might have gotten wrong. Everything will be considered and corrected in the next videos. Thanks for watching and be safe. We'll hear from you soon when the old Witcher speaks once more.